please give it up for Axios congressional reporter Stef Kight.
Good morning. I'm Stef Kight. I'm a congressional reporter at Axios, and I'm one of the co-authors of our Hill Leaders newsletter. Sign up if you want daily news about Congress. There's a lot going on these days. But thank you to all of you for being here with us today. We're going to be chatting with a few guests about the future of home ownership and housing policy in America. If you are following along on the live stream, we ask that you use our hashtag Axios Live. If something stands out to you, tweet away, post on X, post elsewhere, and include the hashtag. Well, I'm really excited to kick things off with our first conversation. I'm joined by a senator who is only in his first term, but has already been out in front on a lot of these issues. So please help me welcome Ohio Senator Bernie Moreno.
Steph.
Hello. Thanks for being with us, Senator.
Of course.
Before we dive into homeownership, housing policy, I did want to get your reaction to Axios had a story yesterday that Democratic leader Chuck Schumer met with Sherrod Brown over the weekend, trying to convince him to jump in. That's, of course, who you beat to get into this seat. What do you make of the rumors of Brown considering another run?
You know, it's hard when you've never worked in a private sector to get a job, so maybe he's having some difficulties there. I'm hoping that Axios could use a reporter in Ohio. You know, Sherrod's available.
We do have some Ohio reporters, in fact, so.
No, I look, John Huston's going to win. He's done a great job here. He's extraordinarily well known throughout Ohio. He's got support from unions. He's got support from the business community. He's done a great job with economic development. He's somebody who is thoroughly popular throughout Ohio. So I can't imagine that Sherrod would run against John, when in my case, when I decided to run, the polling had me at 1% 3 years ago, like 1%. And to make it worse, by the way, the margin of error was 4%. So there was a chance that negative 3% of the people were going to vote for me. So I think John's in good shape. I think Sherrod just likes the attention.
Okay. Well, moving into affordable housing, that's not always a bipartisan topic, but just last week you introduced legislation with Senator Lisa Blunt Rochester. Can you give us the Axios smart brevity on what that legislation would do?
Yeah, basically, if you think about when home builders go to communities to get permits for housing, they have to go through a very extensive process, rightfully so, by the way. You want to make certain that those local communities understand what's being built in those communities. So what we've developed is pattern books. So these are pre-approved building plans that communities would have. We have a fund set up so that communities can get those done. So when a builder comes in and they say, hey, we're going to build a home or a set of homes from the pattern books, the approval process goes from, call it 9 to 12 months to basically 2 to 3 weeks. So they can start quickly. So for home builders, when they have to hold on to these properties, the lots for a long period of time and spend a lot of money on fees, it just raises their costs, which in turn raises the cost of the home itself.
Gotcha. A lot of legislation is introduced. Do you have any sense of whether this has movement in committee, where you think this might go?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's obviously a lot of things that happen in DC that's hyper-partisan, but one thing that shouldn't be, and right now, knock on wood, is not partisan, is this idea of homeownership. Because if you think about the essence of the American dream, in my mind, the way I define it is somebody can go to high school, you can graduate, you can get a good job, you can get married, buy a home, you can raise kids, you can own a car, you can retire with dignity, and only a mom or a dad can work and the other parent stays home with their kids, but that home ownership is an essential piece of it. And unfortunately for a lot of young people, I call it people in their 20s and even mid-30s, home ownership seems extraordinarily elusive, and that can't be the case. So we want to make certain that we make home ownership more affordable, and I'm excited that Chairman Tim Scott of our banking committee is going to put together a very comprehensive bill that addresses all that.
Okay, so there is comprehensive work being done to kind of address this issue.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously, another big one is the Federal Reserve not being obstinate and lowering interest rates to just put us in line with other developed nations, which will also make a big difference in, of course, interest rates. drive a lot of the cost of homeownership.
Right. We're going to get back to the Fed. I know you have a lot of thoughts on that. But first, I wanted to mention in your statement about the bill you introduced with Lisa Blunt Rochester last week, you included the importance of rent reporting. Can you talk a little bit about that issue for you and whether you see that as another issue that there could be federal legislation around?
Yeah, I mean, as you know, it's the vicious circle. And I knew that from owning car dealerships, that people come in to buy a car, buy a home in this case, and they say, well, we can't give you a loan because you don't have a credit history. And well, then that's it's a vicious cycle. What comes first, chicken or the egg? Well, if I can't get a loan because I don't have a credit history, how can I get a credit history if you won't give me a loan? But a lot of people are paying rent. And now that is currently factored in some of the advanced FICO products that they have. The idea is how do we make it easier to allow APIs, for example, to go from checking accounts right directly into FICO or other credit reporting agencies, so that if I'm paying my rent on time, and I've been doing that for 2 or 3 or 4 years, well, that should be my best indicator that I'm going to be a good payer of my mortgage payment. So I think if we can make it easier for the credit score companies to get that data, because as you know, most landlords are small businesses. They don't have hyper sophisticated connections into computer systems. So if we can make it easier for these companies to see that, then rental payments, it should be a big leading indicator of whether you're going to make your payments on time. And that will open up the aperture for people to get more loans, because that's another big piece of it as well.
Right, and there's been a lot of state movement on that issue, state level incentives, but you think this is something the federal government and Congress could do some work on?
Yeah, because you're talking about, when I was in the car business, I also then started a tech company. And what you need to do is you need to make the interconnections for the technology to work well. And the easiest and most predictable way to do it is to have an API from your bank right to the credit reporting agency, because it's easy, right? You're making the same payment every single month. The bank can see that pattern of payments and can report that information right to the credit reporting company. I think the credit reporting companies are happy to have more data, because more data helps their model be more predictive.
Gotcha. Okay, so going back to the Fed, you've been very clear that you're disappointed in the actions of Fed Chair Jerome Powell. First, I just wanted to ask, to be clear, do you believe in the independence of the Fed?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. I was born in South America and moved here when I was a kid. In third world countries, that's a big issue, is that there is no separation. Our monetary system has been a staple of this country for a long time. In fact, it was created by Alexander Hamilton, and even Jefferson, who hated it, tried to get rid of it, but realized, well, there's no really good alternative. So having an independent Fed is really important. But you also need to have somebody competent running the Fed. And Jerome Powell has just proven to be extraordinarily incompetent. There was a decision back in the 30s, the Humphreys decision, which said that that person can be fired for what they called basically ineptitude. And if that doesn't apply to Jerome Powell, I don't know who it would apply to him. That he's losing hundreds of billions of dollars a year. That's never happened in the history of the Fed. He was way too late on raising interest rates. Not necessarily he needed to comment on it, but said, hey, look, if you're going to do massive fiscal stimulus and a supply shock when the supply and demand curves are now in opposite directions, we're going to raise interest rates to kind of cool that off. Didn't do that. We got generationally high inflation, which has led to a lot of the housing inflation we're talking about today. And then it's been too late to lower rates. And if you look at our rates, they're dramatically higher than other developed nations, even though we have lower inflation. Not to mention, of course, the Eccles 1951 and the third building that they have that's cost $3.1 billion in renovations. I mean, this is a town where $3.1 billion is probably the top 10 real estate deals in the entire district. And to spend that on a renovation project, and it shows total mismanagement.
So do you think President Trump would be in his right to fire Jerome Powell?
Absolutely. Because again, you could look at that Humphreys decision and you look at what the Supreme Court looked at. If it doesn't apply to him, then it applies to no agency. So there's clearly incompetence there. And quite honestly, I think the better decision for Jerome Powell is just to resign. Because why put the country through this? I mean, if everybody at Axios wanted you to quit, and including your bosses and everybody who read your articles, what did you just say? No, I'm going to stay. And the guy should just leave and do right by the institution. There's a lot of insanely qualified people that would run the Fed. And by the way, it's costing this country a lot of money. Just a 1 point drop in interest rates costs us over $350 billion with a B dollars per year. That's plus what it costs homeowners and people who have credit cards and car loans and business loans. This is one person with enormous power.
Well, don't you think the idea of the independence of the Fed means that despite what politicians are saying, that he has a job to do? And do you think that people like you, elected politicians, the president himself, speaking out, criticizing, are you worried at all that that undermines the idea of the independence of the
No,
Fed?
not at all, because what I'm saying is the guy's not competent in his job. So independence doesn't mean incompetence. In other words, having an independent Fed doesn't mean you're allowed to have a leader that's incompetent. That obviously doesn't make any sense. You can't be that bad at your job and keep your job in any other place on earth. If you were that bad at your job, you would be fired. If anybody here was that bad at their job, you'd be fired. You can't lose hundreds of billions of dollars and then mismanage a renovation project, which, by the way, probably should never have even been done. The original budget for 4 buildings was $2.1 billion, including the New York Avenue buildings. You take that out, it's 1.7. Now the 1.7, when you add the building that was completed and the 2 that aren't, 3.1 billion. The cost overrun is more than what it costs to build all of City Center. I mean, you can't have somebody who's done so poorly at a job stay in a job. That's what makes people frustrated. That's what voters hate. It's like, hey, I'd lose my job if I did that. Why does this guy get to keep his?
Why do you feel like there aren't more lawmakers who are talking about this issue the way you are?
I think there's certainly a few that are. Certainly I see those conversations happen privately. But look, ultimately the best avenue, Steph, is for him just to do the right thing. He's up in May anyway. I mean, what are we talking about? A handful of months or a little bit more than that? Just resign early. It's no big deal, right? You'll go be a CNN commentator or an MSNBC commentator. You'll be fine. There's lots of market for anti-Trump people on TV. Go do that and let the country have somebody who's going to run the Fed properly.
Well, as a senator, you would have a role in helping decide who would ultimately be his replacement, whether that's before May or in May when his term is up. How important will it be to you to hear that any nominee is dedicated to lowering rates?
Well, what I want to know is what is the metrics he's going to use. So I'll give you an example. In our banking committee hearing a couple weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, when Powell denied that the building had these features, which it clearly does. So did he lie under oath is a question. But he also said that forgiving student debt was a good policy. This is a central banker. Like, the one thing a banker should never say is that forgiving a loan is a good idea. That's extremely crazy commentary. He should stay in his lane. Now, I think the Fed should modify its objectives. As you know, their objective is to control inflation and maximize employment. I disagree with that. I think it should be to control inflation and maximize good employment. I think they should look at it and say, and I actually asked Powell about this. So if every American made minimum wage, would that accomplish your objective? He actually said yes. That's insane. Like, we don't want Americans not having a family-sustaining wage. So the objective should be maximum employment at the maximum possible wage so that people are doing well. They can afford a car. They can afford a house. They can afford to go on vacation every once in a while. They don't have to have 2 or 3 jobs. One parent can work. They can retire with dignity. If we don't rally around that as the real concept of the American dream, we're doing this country a major misservice. What makes this country strong, what's made this country strong, is we have a strong and thriving middle class. That's what we should all be focused on, whether it's the Fed or Congress. All of our decisions should be made around that as the central premise.
Given these kind of big picture concerns you have, do you think the Federal Reserve Act needs to be changed or updated in any way?
Well, look, there's a lot of things that we should talk about. For example, should the Federal Reserve be paying interest rates to bank for their overnight deposits? I think that's a legitimate question that we need to examine a little bit more. So in case you're not sure what I mean by that, banks leave their deposits with the Fed. The Fed pays them interest rates. That's part of where the losses are coming from. Is that really the role? But we're paying interest to probably 40, 50% of those banks are foreign banks. So foreign banks will deposit money in our accounts in the U.S., and the Fed pays them. We're paying foreign banks to house money in America. I don't know that that's a good plan. Maybe it needs to be lowered. There needs to be at least looked at that concept. We need to take a look at that. We need to take a look at, again, at the mission of the Fed. Again, maximum employment at the highest possible wage is what we should modify. And then we need to make certain that we understand what they're looking at when it comes to inflation. I'll give you an example. just common sense would tell you, like you don't have to be a PhD here. If you have a supply shock where supply is going to go dramatically down like we did during COVID when politicians, by the way, not the virus, politicians shut down the economy, and you had massive fiscal stimulus, you're going to drive up demand, you don't have to be a genius to know that prices are going to go up. Supply goes down, demand goes up, prices are going up. You don't, again, that's not a thesis for your PhD. He didn't make those decisions then. Then you look over here and he said, well, I'm not going to lower interest rates. You say, well, why not? Well, because tariffs might lead to higher inflation. Even though inflation is at a 4-year low, it might lead. That's not the proper analysis. One is 100% factually accurate, the other one's not. And there's no difference between tax policy and tariff policy, except that tariff policy can be moved and be temporary. And typically, like we're seeing right now, tariffs are typically absorbed by importers of those home countries. That's why you're not seeing inflation. For example, car prices are actually down from the beginning of the year, even though everybody at the beginning of the year was saying, cars are going to go skyrocket in price. So tariffs is much more difficult, but he didn't comment on tax policy. And what we did with the One Big Beautiful Bill is we kept tax rates low, we incentivized companies to invest, and doesn't factor that in. So it's how would you analyze this? And I think he's looking at it from a very political lens. He should be looking at it from a very apolitical lens.
Well, that is all the time we have. Really quickly, though, you're a coffee guy. Have you found any DC coffee shops that meet your standards?
Dunkin' Donuts. We have a monogamous relationship with Dunkin' Donuts. It's right across the street. They do a great job.
What's your order?
It's half coffee and half steamed milk. In Colombia, they call it café con leche. So for anybody who's out there who's Colombia, they're like, I know what that is. The rest of you is like, ooh, gross. But that's what I drink, with 3 sugars, which explains the jitteriness.
Well, thank you, Senator, for your time. We have to leave it there. Appreciate all of you joining us today. And we have more great guests to come.
Thank you, Steph.